This is The Download from Sounds Profitable, the most important news from this week and why it matters to people in the business of podcasting. I'm Newton Shuttlecotty.
And I'm Gavin Gaddis, sounding sicker than I actually am.
The Download is brought to you by Podscribe. Find out more at podscribe.com.
This week, a look at the landscape of true crime podcast listeners, online car shopping and what that can mean for podcasting, a survey of New Zealand podcast finds gaps in industry knowledge, and video podcasting and YouTube hits a milestone and grows in accessibility. Let's get started.
This Wednesday, Tom Webster debuted a new report titled The True Crime Podcast Consumer, sponsored by Libsyn. The new study is built from the podcast landscape's 5,071 respondents of U.S. residents aged 18 and up. Several of the key findings in the True Crime Podcast Consumer challenge widely held presumptions about brand suitability, listener demographics, and true crime audiences' feelings about advertising and branded content. When asked to list which podcast genres they had consumed in the past 30 days, 16% of Americans 18 and up have consumed a true crime podcast within that time frame. Approximately 42 million people. True crime podcast audiences skew younger than the U.S. population overall, with only 22% of the audience being 55 and up. The genre is incredibly popular with women, with 56% of respondents who consume true crime being female. It also boasts a diverse audience, over-indexing with Hispanic/Latino and Black audiences. Respondents who consume true crime are extremely receptive to brands, both as advertisers and producers of podcast content. 46% of true crime podcast consumers answered more likely to the question, does a company's involvement make you more or less likely to try a new podcast? A 12% more favorable response than non-true crime consumers.
This Monday, Andrew J. Hawkins, writing for The Verge, covered a new way to buy cars in the United States. Starting this week, auto buyers in 48 U.S. cities can browse the inventory of select Hyundai dealerships through a new website called Amazon Auto. Previously, customers could browse cars and compare prices on Amazon, but the actual purchase process had to be completed with a dealership. Now Amazon Auto solves for that, allowing customers to order, finance, and arrange delivery of a vehicle entirely within the Amazon ecosystem. Currently, the only brand available is Hyundai, but that could change in future. Consumers tend to dislike the current dealership system for car buying. A growing direct-to-consumer movement has been gaining traction off the efforts of Tesla, but Amazon Auto finds a middle ground by allowing dealerships to exist, gets their inventory more customers at once, and makes the process much more relaxing for the buyer. While interesting in its own right, from a podcasting perspective, one only has to look at Amazon's current advertising ecosystem to see potential for something big. Amazon's DSP integration with podcast host Art19 would be a natural fit to lean into direct-to-consumer car ads being deployed in Art19 podcasts that have moved countless mattresses over the years. Imagine the affiliate rate or commission on shifting a car with a podcast ad.
Researcher Lewis Tennant recently published an extensive survey and history of podcasting in New Zealand, an academic study charting the history of New Zealand's podcasting scene from 2005 onward, including 722 New Zealand podcasts and a broad examination of podcasting's growth overall. While homegrown podcasts took some time to get off the ground, averaging single-digit new shows per year until 2014, the industry swelled until the COVID boom of 2020, when 154 new Kiwi-produced podcasts were launched. While charting the history of New Zealand podcasting, Tennant found some roadblocks to research that the wider world of podcasting should take note of. A quote from Tennant in the study's abstract, quote, "Undertaking this research project revealed inconsistencies with podcast terminology and issues with conventional podcast categories. There is no ubiquitous list of podcast formats and accompanying definitions of each. When discussing podcasts, genre and topic are often used interchangeably," end quote. With the maturation of podcasting as a medium comes with the importance of academic documentation and establishing industry knowledge. While there are beginner attempts to establish and define a more standardized podcast lexicon, such as the Podcast Industry Glossary, if a researcher doesn't inherently know where to look for such resources, they're at the mercy of increasingly muddy search engine results. Easily accessible educational resources, as well as simple encyclopedic cataloging of information, can serve a dual purpose of helping up-and-coming podcast professionals and enabling those looking to study or write about podcasting the ability to understand the industry jargon, processes, and history without having lived it firsthand.
This Wednesday, David Pierce, writing for The Verge, covered a recent YouTube earnings call. A recurring theme of the call was YouTube's growth on connected televisions becoming a living room mainstay for viewers. Sports content watch time on TVs through YouTube increased 30% year over year, for instance. Similar growth on TVs continues for podcasting, with the platform passing 400 million monthly video podcast watch hours. As coverage quoted in Digital Music News puts it, users have been turning to podcasts similarly to how TV users regularly tune into late-night talk shows. On the YouTube video podcasting front, that content is about to become more accessible worldwide as Google's DeepMind has upgraded Google Translate, and a YouTube implementation is being rolled out in the form of an auto-dubbing feature. The feature will detect the language of a video, supporting English, Spanish, French, German, Hindi, Indonesian, Italian, Japanese, or Portuguese. Once the system detects what language is spoken in the video, it'll generate dub tracks in the other 8 languages. Creators will have the ability to review the dubs before they're published to ensure they're happy with the results. Published auto dubs will have a label applied to the video while the audio track is used to denote to the viewer they're hearing a generated track. The player will also remember language choice and default to it for future videos. Finally, it's time for our quick hits. These are articles that didn't make the cut for today's episode, but they're still worth including in your weekend reading. This week, Reflections on a Podcasting Career by Tom Webster. After 20 years so far in podcasting, Webster celebrates his entrance into the Podcasting Hall of Fame with a look back. BetterHelp remains Australia's top podcast advertiser in Q3, according to ARN's iHeart, and Magellan AI, one of podcasting's biggest advertisers, remains a big player. Speaking of data, Triton Digital's US Podcast Ranker, featuring the top movers and shakers in US-produced podcasts. BBC Studios partners with ARN's iHeart to represent BBC podcasts in Australia. And introducing favorite categories in iOS 18, iOS users will now be able to pick their favorite podcast categories to personalize recommendations and their listener experience. Apple encourages podcast creators to make sure that their categories are properly set behind the scenes.
And that was The Download, brought to you by Sounds Profitable. I know we went through today's stories fast, so be sure to check out the links to every article mentioned right in your podcast listening app or on the download section of soundsprofitable.com. And thank you for sticking with us as we bring you the top stories you might have missed from the past week. I'm Newton Shalokati.
And I'm a recovering Gavin Gaddis. Our producers are myself, Newton Shalokati, Brian Barletta, and Tom Webster. Special thanks to Spreaker for hosting The Download, and special thanks to you for joining us. Robot.
Download complete.